Welcome to the seventh and final video in this 7-part series. In this series, I have been covering what I currently believe to be the sequence of signs and events that will occur between now and the second coming of Jesus Christ. This video series has been prepared from the perspective of a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. If you are not a believer of this faith, you are still more than welcome to listen in. Hopefully you will find some concepts that will improve your faith in the second coming of Jesus Christ. If you have not yet viewed parts 1 through 6 of this series, please go back and watch them first because they convey several foundational elements for this video series. The links to parts 1 through 6 can be found in the description section below. To mention what was discussed in previous episodes, in part 1 I covered signs and events related to the times of the Gentiles. In part 2 I covered signs and events related to the preparation for New Jerusalem. In part 3 I covered signs and events related to the establishment of New Jerusalem. In part 4 I covered signs and events related to the gathering of people to the Church of the Firstborn. In part 5, I covered the signs and events related to the climax at Old Jerusalem, and in part 6, I covered signs and events related to the second coming of Jesus Christ in His glory. In this last video, I will share a possible time frame for the signs and events of the second coming sequence. Section 7. A possible time frame for the second coming signs. As I mentioned in part 1, in this video series, I have not attempted to speculate on the timing for the signs, but I do think it could be helpful to discuss a potential time frame in which these signs could occur. It will give us a sense of the general amount of time it could take for all of these signs to play out. How much time will be needed for the remaining signs to take place? Most Christian eschatologists, both Latter-day Saint and otherwise, have the major second coming signs and events taking place in a 7-year period. But based on all of the signs and events that we have covered in this video series, it seems overwhelmingly impossible for everything that needs to happen to transpire in such a short period of time. We would have to fast forward through several major events at a breakneck speed for everything to be accomplished in just 7 years. It is much more likely to be a somewhat extended period of time than a shorter one. In this video, we will look at a proposed time frame that seems much more feasible. The paradigm that I would like to introduce comes from this book, Hour of God's Judgment, by LDS author Vern G. Swanson. As a side note, I have no financial affiliation with Brother Swanson, and I do not receive any sort of financial gains by sharing his book in this video. In his book, Brother Swanson talks about how God works in patterns. He is a God of order, after all. In addition, we as his children understand things best when there is some form of organization. We understand organization, but we have considerable difficulty with randomness. With regards to the paradigm of the second coming sequence of signs and events, if there is a pattern involved, then we should be able to illustrate it in a way that makes the complexities more simplified. Now let's consider a couple of very interesting scriptures, one in Revelation and one in the Doctrine and Covenants. First, let's look at Revelation chapter 14, verses 6 and 7. And I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation and kindred and tongue and people, saying with a loud voice, Fear God, and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of waters. Next, let's read Doctrine and Covenants, section 88, verse 84. Therefore tarry ye, and labor diligently, that you may be perfected in your ministry to go forth among the Gentiles for the last time, as many as the mouth of the Lord shall name, to bind up the law and seal up the testimony, and to prepare the saints for the hour of judgment which is to come. Both of these scriptures contain the phrase, hour of judgment. On the surface, this wording could just be taken to mean the timing of God's judgment. But let's analyze this phrase a bit more to see if there could be a deeper meaning. In his book, Hour of God's Judgment, Brother Swanson explains that Joseph Smith believed in a 42-year winding up scene. In other words, he believed that the events of the second coming sequence would take approximately 42 years. Here are some of Joseph Smith's published notes on this topic. Written notes from Joseph Smith. Then read chapter 14 of Revelation, 6th verse, where it says, Another angel flying in the midst of heaven. Verse 7, For the hour of his judgment is come to extermination, from the commencement. Commences when an angel commences preaching the gospel. 1 day equals 1,000 years, 1,000 years as 1 day. 41 years, 8 months. In part 4, when we discussed the possible length of the half hour of silence, we established that this period could last for about 21 years. This was based on the concept that 1 day of God's time equals 1,000 years of earth time, as expressed in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. Joseph Smith was applying that same equation to Revelation chapter 14, verse 6 to the phrase hour of judgment. Only this time he was applying it to the length of a full hour instead of just half an hour. So where a half hour of God's time would equal about 21 years, a full hour would equal roughly 42 years. From this we can surmise that it was Joseph Smith's feeling that the second coming events would last approximately 42 years. An important point to bring up here is that of the sabbatical cycle, or a Shmita cycle, which was well known in ancient Israel. A sabbatical cycle is a period of 7 years, with the 7th year called a Shmita year. It was treated as a sort of Sabbath year and was a year of rest for the soil from growing crops. There are several references to this in the Old Testament, including Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, Nehemiah, and others. Additionally, there is the concept of a grand Shmita. This is a cycle of 7 cycles of 7 years, so 7 times 7 years, for a total of 49 years, with the 50th year termed a Jubilee year. This can be referenced in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 8 and 10. And thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years. And the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto thee 49 years. And ye shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee unto you, and ye shall return every man unto his possession, and ye shall return every man unto his family. What Brother Swanson does in his book Hour of God's Judgment is he aligns the concept of the Grand Shmita, which is 7 cycles of 7 years, and the concept of the Second Coming signs lasting about 42 years. To put this into visual perspective, we can see in this illustration that there are 6 periods of 7 years, adding up to a total of 42 years. The 6 periods of 7 years would comprise the period of time called the Hour of God's Judgment. You could also imagine a 7th period of 7 years tacked on to the end. This would be the Sabbath cycle of the Grand Shmita cycle. As I will explain in more detail on the next slide, the first 2 sections of 7 years will be times of tribulation. This will be followed by 3 sections of 7 years that will be times of relative respite. And then there will be a final 7 years of tribulation to complete the 42 years. Interestingly, the sections of signs and events that we have covered in this video series match up extremely well with this time frame structure. The green section of this illustration represents the times of the Gentiles. In part 1, we discussed 11 major signs and events which would occur in this period. The times of the Gentiles began with the restoration of the gospel in 1830, and assuming that this period is nearly over, it will last somewhere in the area of 200 years. When the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, the winding up scene begins. This is the beginning of the 42 years of the hour of God's judgment. The first orange section represents the first 7-year period. In part 2, we discussed signs 12 through 23 of the Second Coming sequence, all of which relate to preparation for New Jerusalem. This 7-year period will be a time of tribulation. The second orange section represents the second 7-year period. In part 3, we discussed signs 24 through 36 of the Second Coming sequence, all of which relate to the actual establishment of the city of New Jerusalem. This 7-year period will also be a time of tribulation. The yellow section represents the third, fourth, and fifth periods of 7 years, for a total of 21 years. This 21-year period equates to the half hour of silence mentioned in Revelation chapter 8, verse 1. In part 4, we discussed signs 37 through 41 of the Second Coming sequence. This 21-year period will be a time of relative respite, at least for the righteous. During this period, the 144,000 will be performing their ministry to gather as many people as possible into the Church of the Firstborn. The third orange section is the 6th and final period of 7 years. In part 5, we discussed signs 42 to 54 of the Second Coming sequence, all of which are related to the climax at Old Jerusalem. This 7-year period will be another time of tribulation. This concludes the 42-year period of the winding up scene, and the second coming of Jesus Christ is imminent. The blue section represents the period of time beginning with the second coming of Jesus Christ in his glory. In part 6, we discussed signs 55 through 62 of the Second Coming sequence. This will be a period of full respite and will last for 1,000 years. This equates to the 1,000 years of the millennium. I find this time frame very useful for understanding how long the winding up scene could take. It will certainly take more than 7 years for all of the signs and events to play out, but I do not think it will be more than 42 years. This concludes part 7 of the Second Coming sequence. To recap, here are the sections of signs and events that we covered in this video, along with their potential time periods. Section 1, the times of the Gentiles, approximately 200 years. Section 2, the preparation for New Jerusalem, 7 years. Section 3, the establishment of New Jerusalem, 7 years. Section 4, the gathering of people to the Church of the Firstborn, 21 years. Section 5, the climax at Old Jerusalem, 7 years, for a total of 42 years, which is the hour of God's judgment. And then Section 6, the second coming of Jesus Christ, which will initiate the millennium, a time period that will last for 1,000 years. This concludes this 7-part video series. Thank you very much for watching this video series to the end. Your questions and comments are all very welcome. Please provide them in the comment section below, and I will do all that I can to address your input. However, please understand that comments which do not contribute to a healthy discussion will be removed. Also, if you have noticed anything which could be an error, or if you have further references that could contribute to this sequence of Second Coming signs and events, please provide your input in the comment section below so that we can further improve and refine this sequence together. Thanks again, and I hope to see you in future videos.